The asteroid Ziltrus 9 was nothing more than a barren rock spinning in the cold abyss of the Andromeda Galaxy. Its surface was jagged and lifeless, its core riddled with metallic veins that promised a steady power source for the ambitious project taking shape above. Suspended in orbit, the Galacticare hospital was a marvel of engineering, a sprawling lattice of titanium alloy and reinforced glass capable of hosting patients from over 30 known species. Dr. Kyle Idris stood in the observation deck of the command module, gazing down at the asteroid's fractured surface. "This is where it all begins," Kyle said to no one in particular. He adjusted the lapel of his uniform, a worn coat that bore patches from decades of medical service across the galaxy. His vision for Galacticare was as vast as the space it inhabited, a universal haven for healing, free from the politics and rivalries that plagued the Galactic Consortium. Here they would cure the incurable, mend the unfixable. Behind him, Marcus Vane entered the room, his presence as heavy as the steel-tipped boots he favored. "We've hit another snag," Marcus said, his voice gruff but not without humor. "Excavations delayed, something weird in the substrata. The boys are nervous." Cale turned, eyebrows raised. "Define weird." Marcus shrugged, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Glowing, pulsing, alive, maybe. Doesn't match any geological scans we've done. Ria's already down there, says it might be biological." Cale sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Of course it is. All right, I'll head down. Let's not jump to conclusions until we have a full analysis." The excavation site was a hive of activity, illuminated by floodlights that cast stark shadows across the jagged walls. Workers moved cautiously around a central pit where the weird object lay exposed. It was unlike anything Kyle had seen before, an organic mass roughly the size of a small vehicle, with a surface that shimmered like an oil slick. It pulsed faintly, emitting a rhythmic vibration that Cale could feel in his bones. Ria Alvara was already crouched near the edge of the pit, her face partially obscured by her helmet. A renowned xenobiologist, Ria had a reputation for being both brilliant and reckless. She didn't look up as Kyle approached. "What are we looking at?" Kyle asked. "It's not from here," Ria said, her voice tinged with awe. "Composition's organic, but nothing I've seen in consortium records. Its surface is reactive, changes texture and color in response to light and sound, and the pulsations, they're rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat." Cale crouched beside her, staring at the alien object. Could it be a remnant of some species? A buried organism? Ria nodded. "Possibly, but if it is, it's not dormant. It's alive." Marcus joined them, his usual bravado tempered by unease. "We can't just leave it here. It's blocking the excavation route for the power plant. What's the call?" Kyle hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave it undisturbed, to seal the pit and build around it. But Galacticare's schedule was tight, and delays would cost more than credits. They could cost lives. "Move it to the bio-research lab," he said finally. "Keep it contained. We'll study it there." Marcus didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "Your call, Doc." The process of relocating the object was fraught with tension. Workers donned reinforced suits and used magnetic cranes to lift the pulsating mass. As it was hoisted out of the pit, the vibrations grew stronger, resonating through the cavern like a low hum. One worker stumbled, swearing as his helmet's visor fogged inexplicably. By the time the object was secured in the bio-research lab, the atmosphere in the station had shifted. Subtle malfunctions began cropping up, lights flickering, doors refusing to seal properly, and an unshakable sense of unease creeping into the crew. Kale brushed it off as nerves. He spent the next few days overseeing construction, ensuring that the quarantine wing and the infirmary were outfitted with the best equipment the galaxy had to offer. But the object remained on his mind, and every time he crossed paths with Rhea, she seemed more consumed by her analysis. "It's evolving," Rhea said during one of their rare breaks in the mess hall. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "The surface patterns are changing. I think it's responding to us, to the environment. This isn't just some random organism. It's intelligent." Kale frowned. "And dangerous?" Rhea hesitated. "Too early to tell." Later that evening, Kale visited the lab himself. The artifact was contained in a reinforced stasis chamber, its pulsations muted by the thick walls. Yet, as Kale approached, he felt a faint vibration in his chest, like the resonance of a deep bass note. He stared at the swirling colors on its surface, mesmerized despite himself. A noise broke his trance, a faint scraping sound. He turned sharply but saw nothing out of place. Shaking his head, he left the lab, the unease following him like a shadow. In the days that followed, the anomalies grew. Equipment failed without explanation. Workers reported strange dreams of shifting, organic landscapes. One technician claimed to have seen the walls breathing, though no one believed him. And always the artifact pulsed, a steady beat that seemed to sync with the station itself. Kale tried to focus on the work, on the promise of Galacticare, but a gnawing doubt had taken root. Something about the artifact felt wrong, like a splinter buried too deep to extract. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew one thing for certain. They had awakened something, and it was watching. The bloom began in the quiet hours when most of the crew were asleep or off duty. In the sterile confines of the bio-research lab, the artifact pulsed faintly, a rhythm so low it was almost imperceptible. Its surface, once smooth and shimmering, began to ripple, as if something beneath was struggling to break free. Rhea Alvara had spent most of her evening analyzing tissue samples taken from the artifact's surface. Under the microscope, the cells were unlike anything she'd encountered. Semi-transparent, constantly shifting, and capable of splitting and reforming in patterns that defied biological norms. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion tugging at her, but curiosity kept her tethered to her work. Her arm throbbed faintly where the artifact's secretion had grazed her days earlier. The wound was small, a pale scar surrounded by faint discoloration, but it itched persistently. She scratched at it absent-mindedly as she leaned in closer to her terminal, compiling her notes. Without warning, the artifact emitted a low, guttural sound, almost a growl. Rhea froze, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. She turned toward the containment chamber. The artifact's colors were shifting erratically now, its pulsations increasing in frequency. As she approached, the glass of the containment chamber began to fog, not from the inside but from her side, as if the chamber itself was reacting to her presence. "Kale needs to see this," she muttered, but before she could turn away, the artifact's surface split open. It wasn't a violent rupture, but a slow, deliberate unfurling. A thick, black liquid seeped out, sliding down the chamber's walls and pooling at the bottom. For a moment, Rhea could only stare. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, the liquid shot outward, lashing at the glass. The containment alarm blared, snapping Rhea into action. She stumbled back, her mind racing as she slammed her hand against the emergency seal button. The stasis chamber locked down, reinforced panels sliding into place over the glass. But the liquid didn't stop. Tendrils began forming from the pool, thin and whip-like, probing the edges of the chamber as if searching for a weakness. Rhea bolted from the lab, her heart pounding. She barely noticed the faint ache in her arm growing sharper, the veins near the scar turning a subtle shade of black. By morning, the bio-research lab was in chaos. The containment chamber had failed during the night, and the liquid, now identified as a living entity, had spread throughout the lab. The organic tendrils had fused with equipment, growing and hardening into coral-like structures. The walls and floors were veined with black, pulsating growths that emitted a faint hum. Kyle stood in the doorway, his face pale. What the hell happened here? Rhea, pale and trembling, recounted the events as best she could. "It's not just a substance," she said. "It's a life form, and it's adapting. Rapidly." Marcus arrived moments later, his usual calm demeanor replaced with grim determination. "We've got a bigger problem," he said. "One of the workers, the janitor, collapsed in the infirmary. They're saying his skin changed." Kale and Rhea followed Marcus to the infirmary, where the scene was even worse than the lab. The janitor's body was sprawled on a cot, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. His skin was riddled with growths, small, jagged protrusions that gleamed like wet glass. Black veins spread from his neck down to his arms, pulsating in sync with the vibrations that now seemed to emanate from the very walls. "He was cleaning the lab last night," Rhea whispered. "He must have come into contact with the secretion." The man's eyes snapped open suddenly, and he let out a guttural scream that sent chills through the room. His body convulsed violently, and the growths began to expand, cracking his skin as they emerged. Tendrils burst from his arms, lashing out at the nearest nurse, who barely dodged in time. Kyle grabbed a medical scalpel from the tray and drove it into the man's chest, but it was too late. The janitor's body collapsed into a mass of writhing flesh, merging with the floor and spreading outward. Panic spread through the station as quickly as the infection. By midday, 3 more staff members reported symptoms: fever, discoloration, and skin abnormalities. Kyle ordered an immediate lockdown of the bio-research wing, but the infection seemed to ignore barriers, creeping through vents and water systems. Infected individuals began to exhibit disturbing behavior. One engineer, previously silent and reserved, began chanting in an unfamiliar language as black growths consumed his torso. Another worker clawed at her skin, screaming about voices in her head before collapsing into a heap of fleshy tendrils. Rhea, despite her growing symptoms, worked tirelessly to analyze the infection. "It's not just consuming them," she said, her voice strained. "It's reprogramming their biology." They're becoming something else. Kyle clenched his fists, his mind racing. We need to contain this. Now. Marcus arrived with a grim report. The air filtration system is compromised. Whatever this thing is, it's in the station's infrastructure now. We can't stop it from spreading. Rhea looked up from her workstation, her eyes dark with exhaustion. Then we have to find a way to kill it, before it kills us all. Kyle met her gaze, the weight of leadership pressing heavily on his shoulders. Do whatever it takes, he said, but we're running out of time. As the station descended further into chaos, the artifact pulsed in its ruined containment chamber, its colors shifting faster now, its rhythm echoing through every corridor. The bloom had begun, and it wasn't going to stop. The infection had transformed the lower levels of Galacticare into a grotesque alien landscape. What had once been sterile corridors and pristine laboratories was now a labyrinth of pulsating flesh and hardened tendrils. Lights flickered erratically, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air was thick and humid, carrying an unsettling organic scent that clung to the back of the throat. Every step Kyle Idris took felt heavier, the weight of responsibility grinding into his shoulders. The survivors were dwindling. What had started as a crew of over 200 was now less than 50, most either consumed by the infection or turned into something unrecognizable. The remaining staff huddled in the upper levels, barricading themselves in the medical bay and control rooms. But even those safe havens were not guaranteed. The infection had begun to creep upward, spreading through the air ducts and wiring, its reach unrelenting. Kyle stood in what remained of the central operations room, staring at the holographic map of the station. It was a patchwork of red, areas marked as compromised or overrun. Only a few pockets of blue remained, and even those were shrinking by the hour. Marcus Vane leaned against the console, his face pale but resolute. Rhea Alvara sat nearby, her arm bandaged, though the dark veins creeping up her neck betrayed the infection's relentless advance. We can't stay here, Marcus said, breaking the tense silence. It's only a matter of time before it takes this level too. We need a plan. Cale nodded slowly, his mind racing. The artifact is the source. It's controlling the infection, spreading it like a hive mind. If we destroy it, we destroy the station, Rhea interrupted, her voice hoarse but firm. It's integrated into everything now. Power, air circulation, even structural integrity. If we take out the artifact, Galacticare goes with it. Then we make sure it doesn't spread beyond this rock, Marcus said, his tone grim. Containment becomes the mission. Kyle glanced at Rhea. Do we have any way to kill it? Something that doesn't involve us all dying in the process. Rhea hesitated, her fingers twitching as she fought to maintain control. I've been running tests on the growths I extracted earlier. They're resilient, adaptive, but they're vulnerable to high-frequency ultraviolet radiation. If we overload the artificial sun generator in the central power plant, we could flood the station with UV. It won't be pretty, but it should sterilize everything. Kyle grimaced. And by everything, you mean? Rhea met his gaze, unflinching. Everything. The infected, the growths, any chance this thing has to survive. but the generators deep in the lower levels, right in the heart of the Hive. The journey to the central power plant was a descent into hell. Kyle, Rhea, Marcus, and a small team of engineers armed themselves with whatever tools and makeshift weapons they could find. The infected were no longer just shambling victims of the disease. They had evolved into something far more coordinated. As the team moved deeper, they encountered horrifying hybrids, bodies fused with the walls, their limbs elongated and twisted, acting as sentinels for the Hive. The infection was intelligent. It knew they were coming. The first attack came without warning. A cluster of tendrils burst from a vent, wrapping around one of the engineers and dragging him screaming into the darkness. The others fired improvised plasma cutters, severing the tendrils. But it was too late. His screams were cut short, replaced by the sickening sound of flesh merging with flesh. "Move!" Marcus barked, pushing the group forward. The path ahead was a maze, with corridors narrowing as the infection's growths constricted the space. At one point, they were forced to crawl through a tunnel lined with pulsing, translucent membranes, the walls warm and wet to the touch. Kyle felt his resolve falter. Every breath felt like inhaling disease itself. He glanced back at Rhea, who was moving slower now, her body visibly succumbing to the infection. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy, but her determination burned as fiercely as ever. "Don't stop for me," she whispered when she caught his gaze. "We finish this." The power plant was unrecognizable. Once a marvel of human engineering, it had been overtaken by the artifact's influence. The generator core, a towering structure of spinning rings and glowing plasma, was now encased in a lattice of hardened tendrils. At its base, the artifact pulsated, larger than ever, its surface a chaotic swirl of colors and textures. The air buzzed with energy, and the sound was deafening, a constant, droning hum that rattled their teeth. As the team approached, the infected emerged. They weren't just mindless drones anymore. They moved with purpose, their grotesque forms bristling with organic weaponry. One lunged at Kyle, its jaw splitting open to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. He swung a wrench, connecting with a sickening crunch, but another creature was already upon him. Marcus charged forward, firing a handheld plasma cutter. The blast seared through the infected, but the others didn't flinch. They kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. The team fought desperately, the room devolving into chaos. "We're out of time," Rhea shouted, her voice cutting through the din. She staggered toward the generator, clutching the device they'd brought to overload the system. Black veins bulged along her arms and neck, but she didn't stop. Kyle fought his way to her side, fending off an infected creature that had sprouted jagged spines from its back. "Rhea, you can't—" "I'm already gone," she said, her voice soft but resolute. She pressed the device against the generator's control panel, her hands shaking as she keyed in the override sequence. The generator began to hum louder, its spinning rings glowing brighter. The artifact reacted violently, its pulsations turning erratic. Tendrils shot out, piercing walls and floors as it tried to defend itself. One lashed toward Rhea, but Kyle intercepted it, the impact throwing him to the ground. "Get out of here," Rhea yelled, her voice breaking. "Finish the mission." Kyle hesitated for a fraction of a second before Marcus grabbed him, pulling him toward the exit. "We can't save her," Marcus said, his voice heavy with grief. "She's saving us." As they ran, the generator's light intensified, bathing the infected in searing ultraviolet rays. Screeches filled the air as the growths began to disintegrate, their forms breaking apart into ash-like particles. The artifact's surface cracked, its pulsations slowing as the generator reached critical overload. Cale and Marcus barely made it to the upper levels before the explosion ripped through the station. The blast of ultraviolet radiation consumed everything, erasing the infection and the hive in one blinding instant. When Kyle awoke in the emergency shuttle, the silence was deafening. Marcus sat across from him, his face haggard but alive. Through the viewport, the asteroid's surface glowed faintly, the remnants of Galacticare reduced to smoldering ruins. Kyle closed his eyes, the weight of their losses pressing down on him. Rhea was gone, along with most of the crew, but the infection was stopped. For now. In the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the memory of the artifact's final moments. It hadn't just been fighting to survive, it had been calling out, its pulsations echoing into the void. And somewhere out there, Kyle was certain, something had answered. The shuttle hung in the cold void, silent and still, like a tomb drifting through the endless darkness of space. Kyle Idris sat alone in the cockpit, staring out at the asteroid below. What was left of Galacticare was barely recognizable. The station had collapsed in on itself, a smoldering ruin spread across the jagged surface of Ziltrus 9. Thin plumes of smoke twisted upward, dissipating into the vacuum, leaving behind only silence. Marcus Vane entered the cockpit, his heavy boots clanging against the metal floor. He moved slower than usual, his body battered and his spirit broken. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes hollow, reflecting the same despair Kyle felt in his chest. "It's over," Marcus said quietly, leaning against the wall. "The infection's gone. We did it." Kyle didn't respond. He couldn't bring himself to. The weight of their victory felt hollow, the cost too steep to celebrate. Hundreds of lives had been lost, consumed by the artifact's reach. Rhea's face flickered in his mind, a mix of defiance and resignation in her final moments as she keyed in the override. He could still hear her voice, raw and determined, telling him to leave her behind. "You're thinking about her," Marcus said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Kyle nodded, his throat tight. "She was the bravest of us all. She was infected, Kyle. If she hadn't done what she did, none of us would have made it out." Marcus's voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath the words, a grief he couldn't fully mask. She knew what was at stake. Kyle clenched his fists, the leather of his gloves creaking. "And yet, I still feel like I failed her. Failed everyone." "You didn't fail," Marcus said firmly, his voice rising. "You kept us going when no one else could. You stopped that thing from spreading. You saved the rest of us." Cale didn't respond, his gaze locked on the asteroid below. In his mind, the mission was a Pyrrhic victory at best. Yes, they had stopped the infection, but at what cost? The promise of Galacticare, a universal haven for healing, a beacon of hope, was now nothing more than ash and debris. As he stared, a faint flicker caught his attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, a faint pulse of light from deep within the ruins. His heart sank. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the console. "Marcus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see that?" Marcus followed his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their eyes fixed on the faint, rhythmic glow emanating from the collapsed station. It was slower now, weaker, but it was there, the artifact's pulse. "It's still alive," Marcus said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "After all that," Cale's mind raced. The ultraviolet radiation should have sterilized the infection, destroyed the artifact entirely. But the pulse remained, defiant, a grim reminder of its resilience. He felt a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "If it's alive, it's still a threat," Cale said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We can't leave it here." "What are you saying?" Marcus asked, though the answer was already clear. Cale turned to him, his expression resolute. "We finish this, completely." The shuttle's engines roared to life as Cale and Marcus prepared for their final descent. They had salvaged what little remained of their equipment, emergency suits, plasma cutters, and a single containment unit designed for high-risk biohazards. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The descent was silent, neither of them speaking as they approached the asteroid's surface. The faint pulse grew brighter as they neared, its rhythm syncing with Kyle's heartbeat, a haunting echo of the nightmare they thought they'd escaped. The ruins of Galacticare were a twisted graveyard of steel and flesh. The infection's remnants were scattered across the debris, charred and lifeless, but the artifact had survived, buried beneath layers of rubble. The glow led them to it, a beacon in the dark. Kyle and Marcus worked in grim silence, clearing the debris piece by piece. As they dug deeper, the pulse grew stronger, the artifact's light casting eerie shadows against the ruined walls. When they finally unearthed it, Cale felt his breath catch in his throat. The artifact was smaller now, shriveled and cracked, but it was still alive. Its surface shimmered faintly, its pulsations slow but deliberate. It was weakened, but not defeated. "We have to destroy it," Cale said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. Marcus hesitated. "What if we can't? What if this thing adapts again?" Cale stared at the artifact, his mind flashing back to the infected, those horrifying hybrids of flesh and alien growth. He thought of Rhea, her body overtaken but her spirit unbroken. He thought of the crew who had trusted him, followed him, and died under his command. "Then we make sure it doesn't have the chance," he said. Using the plasma cutters, they began dismantling the artifact, severing its tendrils and cracking its outer shell. It screeched in response, a sound that wasn't a sound but a vibration that rattled their bones and filled their minds with static. Kyle pushed through the noise, his hands steady as he drove the cutter deeper into the artifact's core. As the final tendril was severed, the artifact emitted one last, deafening pulse, a burst of energy that knocked them both to the ground. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the glow faded, the pulsations stopped, and the artifact crumbled into ash. Kyle lay on the ground, staring up at the black sky. His chest heaved, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Marcus sat up slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. "Is it over?" he asked. Coyle nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. "It's over." Back on the shuttle, Cale stared out at the asteroid one last time. The ruins of Galacticare were quiet now, the infection gone, the artifact destroyed. The cost had been immeasurable, but the threat was finally contained. As they prepared to leave, Kyle felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He thought of Rhea, of her sacrifice, and the countless lives that had been saved because of it. The dream of Galacticare was gone, but perhaps, in time, something new could rise from its ashes. As the shuttle drifted away, the last remnants of the station disappeared into the void, leaving behind only silence. Kyle closed his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to rest.